India-Canadian relationship has been described as one of the most stable over the years. But recent events involving a revival of the Khalistan movement of Sikh nationalists is making us question whether the stability of this relationship is at stake, particularly when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is visiting India. Reza, some of the recent events have been troubling.
Yeah, well, I mean, two incidents particularly. One, the presence of Prime Minister Trudeau at an event where a lot of Khalistani paraphernalia was displayed, posters of Bhindranwale, all sorts of messages from Khalistani nationalists. And the other incident more recently of the CRPF officer, Dhillon, who was turned back from Canada because the government thought that his organization, the CRPF, had been involved in torture and human rights abuses. Although the Canadian High Commissioner stepped in and said that this incident didn't reflect the official position of the government, and they in fact gave the CRPF officer a free ticket to go back to Canada. This is the sort of events that are raising questions about what was essentially, as you said, a very stable relationship.
I mean, in the case of this officer, the former CRPF officer Dhillon, the latest is that he had to cut short his visit to Canada because a group called Sikhs for Justice has filed a case against him over his alleged torture in his past roles in CRPF while he was posted in Punjab. Government seems to be in some way forced because of the larger liberalism of this particular administration. Somehow its hand is being forced to take a certain stance about these things, isn't it?
Well, I mean, Canada is possibly one of the most liberal countries in the world. Freedom of expression and this sort of liberalism is fine. I mean, this is what all governments are entitled to, have a position on these things. But the fundamental question here is the rise of these Khalistani groups, and this is something that has been happening over the past few years. Some time ago, we had the reports of a training camp being run by the Khalistanis in Canada. We've had other problems associated with the Khalistanis. There has been a marked uptick in protests by Khalistanis along with Kashmiri groups in both Canada and Britain. And in Canada, there has been quite a bit of evidence. Our correspondent in Canada has uncovered evidence of how Pakistani diplomats have been participating in these events organized by the Khalistanis. So this is something that is, raising questions in Delhi. This is something that is worrying the foreign ministry and is also worrying the Indian government.
Let's face it, there has been violence on both sides when the Khalistan movement, the Punjab, the Sikh nationalist movement was going on in the 80s and the 90s. But there was a sense of closure that this is over. I mean, we had violent incidents like the Kanishka bombing, part of which was from a conspiracy hatched in Canada. But then there was some sense that it is over. But now, apparently, with some help from Pakistan also, this seems to be having a revival in Canada.
Well, I mean, the Khalistanis in India are a spent force. I mean, there has been no Khalistan movement for a long time. They have no supporters. But it's in pockets, I mean, you have some Khalistanis in Britain, you have some of them in UK, you have some of them in US and in Canada. Now, so these are the people who have been sort of trying to get together, regroup. And as you mentioned, the Kanishka bombing, which was possibly the worst act of terrorism perpetrated by the Khalistanis, happened, it was planned on Canadian soil, it was hatched on Canadian soil, and virtually nobody was punished for it. Just one person was imprisoned, and it
that
really went
free.
Yeah, and he walked out free just some time ago.
Yeah.
So, there is, I mean, I'm not saying that the Khalistan movement has become very strong overnight, but there is a need to address this concern that India has.
Yeah, I think India is also angry with the fact that one of the provincial governments in Canada has passed a resolution calling the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Delhi, which we condemn as a genocide.
Yeah, well, this was a Canadian assembly, a provincial assembly, which passed this resolution. There were unsuccessful attempts in the past to pass a similar resolution, but it never happened.
Yeah.
But this is something that did anger the Indian government. So, these are issues clearly that the two sides will have to address before Prime Minister Trudeau flies into New Delhi.
So when Mr. Trudeau comes calling, obviously you are saying that there has to be some sort of confidence building measures. What kind of measures should Canada, what kind of sort of rhetorical as well as optical and real policy changes should
Well,
Canada be doing?
I mean, the Indo-Canadian relationship is strong, it's stable, there are all sorts of facets to it. This is just one facet, but this is a facet that worries New Delhi. So it's pretty clear that the Canadian government will have to act in such a way that it assures the Indian government that there is not going to be any sort of revival of Khalistani movement on Canadian soil, and that India's interests will not be harmed in any way.
Yeah. In this quick take, we asked the question: is the relationship between India and Canada being held hostage by a revival of the Khalistan movement in Canada? Thanks for watching.